Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and you are in for a real treat today because I'm in for a real treat today. I've got Jared Connors and Travis Miller, both from Assent Compliance, and we're going to talk about the evolution of the work both of these guys have done in conflict minerals, supply chain, compliance, evolving to ESG, and the role Assent Compliance plays in this currently as a product provider. So if I could ask you both to introduce yourselves and tell us your current roles with Assent. Jared, could we start with you?
Yeah, you bet. Very happy to be here, Tom. Great to talk to you again. My role at Assent is to support the development of our environmental, social, and governance solution here. So I'm engaging with the market, going and talking to companies, associations, various makers of standards, and defining what we can do to support the supply chain ESG programs for our clients.
Travis?
Great. Yeah, my name's Travis Miller. I'm an attorney, environmental scientist by training. I've probably worked with most of the Fortune 500 manufacturers at some point in my career. Here at Assent, I serve as the company's general counsel, but I'm also a member of the same regulatory and subject matter expert team that Jared is, which basically serves as a back office or an extension of all of our clients. My principal job here at Assent is to make sure that Jared does what he's supposed to do, which is challenging and trying for the best of times.
So, Jared, if I could start with you, you began your professional career early on in conflict minerals. You've been in that area or started in that area really as far back as many of the folks I personally know. And I wanted to ask you, starting with your experience in conflict minerals, where do you see the evolution from, I see it directly from conflict minerals to ESG, but how do you see that evolution?
Yeah, it's really interesting because the market has been going in that direction slowly since about the fall of 2018 into a broader context of environmental focus, not just the social aspects of responsible minerals, because that's where it really got started, was about this labor rights initiative in Central Africa and the DRC and adjoining countries. But it's gone beyond there since then. You see metals associations that are more focused on the audits of the smelters and refiners, on environmental topics, good governance practices. And then also what you see is a big expansion into a broader set of other minerals beyond the legislated tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold. So we're seeing adoption in the market of non-ferrous metals to start for companies who are saying, I need to do more to be a better corporate citizen, and I need to do more a part of my commitment for environmental, social, and governance to go out and be better at responsible sourcing. And so they're taking on the periodic table of elements in their responsible minerals program. And just to give you some context, if you think about the number of companies subject to the regulation in the United States, it's a pretty limited number. It's in the teens, right? Somewhere between 11 and 14,000 companies are directly subject to Dodd-Frank 1502, the conflict minerals legislation. Here at Assent, we take in nearly 200,000 conflict minerals reporting templates on a given year. So the sheer volume of companies who've stood up and said, I have a commitment to doing this because it's a part of my environmental, social, and governance program, that just speaks volumes to how many companies understand what they can do and why that's so important to their overall ESG strategy.
Travis, a couple of weeks ago, my wife and I went on a short vacation, and we went to 2 national parks in Texas. And every time I see a national park, I'm reminded that you have taken and see compliance evolving literally from the 19th century, beginning with a conservation movement and the establishment of national parks as the beginnings of the environmental movement. But you see that as a direct connection to compliance. And I wanted to ask you, do you see that same evolution going to ESG, or have we just come full circle from something Teddy Roosevelt said to us in 1896 and going forward?
Good old Teddy. So I'd suggest this to you. I think that once again, we're seeing law catch up with business practice. But the business practices that are now being caught up with are a little bit different. For the last 30 to 40 years, pretty much every company in the world has focused on outsourcing, globalization. Where can I move three things? And this is always kind of like the same three pattern requirements that companies consider. It's got to be something that is the highest regulated, the most dangerous, and the least profitable. That's what you send outside your company. So inevitably, we get to the conclusion, who takes that up? Who are the people that are willing to absorb the most dangerous, most highly regulated, and least profitable work? At Assent, we've come to the conclusion that, those are probably the nefarious actors. And I'd argue to you or submit to you that that is the same thing, that the new laws, the new ESG movement, the investors who are looking at those risk factors are most concerned with. They see in the supply chain all of the risk. It's no longer the fact that you have another Enron brewing, where there's bribery and cooking the books inside the company. That's very rare these days. It is the case that almost everybody has those types of consequences buried, a tier or two below their supply chain. And that's where the efforts are now being dictated. That's where everybody's putting the requirements and the governance procedures, the social procedures, the environmental procedures to combat those ills.
Jared, we've had the opportunity to work together at a previous employer, and in that job, you were really one of the first people I met who talked about supply chain risk management as a driver of business efficiency. Yes, there's risk, and we have to manage that risk, but you really took it a step further that your company can become more business efficient if you manage effectively your supply chain risk. And I really wanted to use that as a backdrop to ask you about the role you see for supply chain in ESG and how you really communicate that message today.
Yeah, you bet. It's I remember my very first experience with a big governance issue in electronic supply chain, and that was a typhoon that hit Southeast Asia and caused a bunch of wafers and different components that are fixed to your motherboard and your laptop to be, moisture sensitive products to be ruined essentially, right? And it was clear that companies didn't have this good governance practice of business continuity with their suppliers to go out and address, disaster recovery concerns, right? And so business continuity planning was one of the first things I saw under the governance issue of ES&G, where companies said, we need to have a good handle on this. It's because we're losing money, we're expensing more, within our supply chain to dry these goods out, to toss a bunch of goods that we had to eliminate due to failure rates. And then you see issues in the 2008 financial crisis where companies just said, that's it. Our CSR programs are a nice to have and we need to shut this down. And you saw all these labor violations happening throughout the supply chain. And so companies went, this is actually costing us money, right? This is costing us reputationally. It's costing us for certain infraction issues. It's costing us in the consumer market. And then most importantly, what's happening is we're having to then move our supply chain even further out into other countries and other places because these suppliers are no longer acceptable, what we've been working with and letting them get away with, if you will, during the 2008 financial crisis. And so it just cascades over time when these impacts hit us, and companies, the first thing you realize is it's not just a social issue. It's not just an environmental impact. It's not just a supply issue. It's all about dollars. And when you start to think about the ROI that's present in your ESG program, that's when you get good efficiency. That's when you realize the value of your overall ESG program is actually in the ROI itself. And that's one of the coolest things for me to be able to see, having done this for a while, because, as I was coined many, many years ago by my boss at Intel, Jared's the hippie, let him go work on this stuff in the supply chain and CSR. I'm being realized as, this guy actually had an opportunity to save us money in some of the things he was doing. He wasn't just there for the feel good activities, right? But it certainly does feel good when you're helping people in their livelihoods and having a greater impact on the environment. But then when you see that and an opportunity for business to profit from that, it definitely makes it more enticing for organizations to invest in their ESG programs.
So Travis, one of the things that has come up over the past maybe even 10 years, led I think by the United Kingdom, but perhaps other countries, has been the fight against modern slavery. And I can still remember the first time I heard a presentation on this in Houston about 2011 or 2012. And I was then working heavily in the energy industry, and I was sitting next to a colleague, and I said, we might have a problem with some of our workboats in West Africa. And he looked at me and said, we might have a problem with some of our workboats in Louisiana. And it drove home to me the message that, we have potential problems in the United States. And so I wanted to use that as an introduction to ask you how you see the modern slavery movement as helping to not only drive ESG, but in addition to the S part of it, do you see broader implications going forward?
I do. So I like the analogy, if you think about ESG, that our CEO, Andrew Waitman, always uses it. He says, what's the most important letter in the ESG? And the answer is it's P. It's P. Because the E stands for the products, the S stands for the people that are making them, and the G stands for the policies that protect the products and the people. So when you think about modern slavery, forced labor, indentured servitude, moving people, you have to get really pragmatic about the economics, unfortunately. The people that are enslaved, the people that fall into these indentured servitude camps, and the people who are the most valuable to nefarious actors, generally speaking, are going to be middle-aged folks. They're going to be younger, like 18 to 30-year-olds, because they got more working years in front of them. Me and my bad knees, Jared and his bad back. Tom, I'm sure you got an ailment or two somewhere in there. But we're not going to be the best candidates for something like this. Neither is a young child. Because those young children, they have to be raised, they have to be taken care of, they have to be fed. You got to teach them things. So what's really happening, and I recall this, very vividly, the first time where I did an on-site investigation in Malaysia, is you have people that have a completely different set of morals or a completely different set of perceptions on what constitutes human rights and the way that you should treat or manage folks. I went into a packaging plant, inside, and packaging I mean by semiconductor packaging, where you're sealing all the goods and kind of enclosing them. And we started driving out of Kuala Lumpur out to the suburbs. And I was shocked how beautiful it was. The plantations were as far as the eye could see. It looked like a little suburban town. And I asked the driver, I said, I don't see a fence in sight. He says, yeah. Malaysia is the second safest city, second safest country in all of Asia. Very safe, beautiful place. I said, I'm blown away. Then we pull up to the facility and we go through. Everything's open, very transparent, clean, beautiful. So this is amazing. But where are the people? Who does all the work? So we take another little drive and we pull up to a compound with barbed wire fences and people standing out with guns. I said, well, what's going on here? It's like, well, these are all the workers. And he then proceeds to tell me all about his corporate social responsibility program, where they go into Indonesia and they get the young girls, only the girls, because the guys will fight and they'll cause issues. And then they make an offer to their parents. And the offer is, we'll put $5,000 on their books, but in exchange for that $5,000, your daughter's not going to go to a brothel. She's not going to become a housekeeper. She's not going to live in a slum. We're going to teach them English. They're going to get an education. They're going to learn how to do semiconductor packaging. So, for that kind of a trade-off for just 3 to 5 years of her life, she's going to get those things. And there's a lot of people that took that offer. This is the kind of challenges that you deal with when you talk about modern slavery. Like, this is the kind of stark reality that so many people around the world are facing that just is beyond our conscience. Is it enough to send your daughter effectively to an indentured servitude camp? Well, they'll be watched at gunpoint because they're going to get these things. They're going to get these opportunities. And the answer to that's really tough.
Jared, let me pick up on one of the things you said in a prior answer. You talked about moving from disaster recovery to business continuity. And I'd like to add a third component, which is business as usual, meaning that sort of post-pandemic, businesses now have to plan for the black swan event, whatever that may be, and however low that may appear on a risk profile, and it can be anything from 1,000-year flood to a war in Central Asia. And so I wanted to use that as an introduction to ask you how more effective supply chains and supply chain risk management can help companies not simply operate with greater efficiency, but respond and have the flexibility to respond to events that may not have been on a risk profile, but have now occurred.
Yeah, let's pick on conflict minerals as a great example right now. Okay, conflict minerals started out as a regulation to support Dodd-Frank 1502 for compliance to sourcing from Central Africa, essentially, right? The biggest risk in early 2022 to companies' conflict minerals disclosures has nothing to do with Central Africa, right? It has to do with other issues that they've identified within their upstream, like sanctions against Russian companies, right? And so these types of activities, when you think about it, says that I need to have a greater profile of my overall suppliers. I need to dig deeper into their actions to make sure that they're accountable on different topics. Who is involved in the ownership of those companies? What legal affiliations do they have? So we need to be digging deeper, peeling back more of the onion layers on these companies, because we need to be ready for the next thing, whether it's a wave of sanctions or another version of the Panama Papers or a big to-do about labor rights in Southeast Asia. Whatever it means that we need to be ready and have more transparency to the activities within these suppliers. So we need to be digging deeper on those suppliers and make sure they have good policies, management procedures, essentially that they have internal controls so that we can be assured that whatever behaviors that happens within their facilities, because we can't be there 24/7, that those behaviors are not going to hit us behind the left ear as their downstream customers. And so the more of a dialogue that we create with our supply chain, the more effective our management process and transparency with those suppliers is, and then the less risk that we have, whether we know exactly what that next risk is going to be or not. So that's what's so important about making sure that we understand our suppliers is being able to understand more about their organization and their commitments. So opening a dialogue, it might as well be called that rather than environmental, social, and governance anymore, is just creating transparency with my supply chain.
Travis?
Yeah, I'd suggest that what we're seeing more than anything else is a recognition that potentially, one phone versus another phone, one circuit board versus another circuit board aren't necessarily the defining characteristics that differentiate them. Like their performance is roughly equivalent. There's a new feature or two that gets added to each new device. But now it really boils down to the risk. And those non-financial risks are probably larger and a bigger concern. It's why there's been so much pressure for the investor disclosures. It's why the law is starting to change in the way that it is. In Europe, all the things that we historically grew up thinking as being financial versus CSR, like internal programs, the marketing stuff that you would put in, are now mandatory. And it's because of these black swan events. It's the world reacting to the fact that a supply chain disruption in China at a port because a COVID outbreak happens has ripple-on effects. It's like throwing a big rock in the pond and watching it ripple out. And now we need a way that we can diagnose that we can look beyond the next quarter. Because these events, as you mentioned, Tom, are getting more and more predictable. And because we've diversified our operations to such an extent in so many different global communities, like one domino that falls triggers the next, and triggers the next, and triggers the next, until the point where we can't get microchips that allow us to assemble Fords inside of Dearborn, Michigan. That's the kind of realities that we're facing now. That decoupled with the destabilization that's really starting to happen in the global economy is forcing a reshoring, a regionalization of manufacturing. And if you look at the economic numbers, it's unbelievable. America has never seen a time where we've been growing like this in probably the last 50 plus years. The Q4 numbers came in at like 6.9% GDP growth. I mean, it was predicted we would never get above 2%, not more than a decade ago. Now, that does come with inflation and a whole bunch of other things. We do recognize that. But what's happening is these multi-billion-dollar investments into semiconductor manufacturing plants, these multi-billion-dollar investments into new construction projects, trillions of dollars that are flowing in. America is retooling for the 21st century. And I think we're in pole position really to achieve that if we kind of focus and, keep our attention where it belongs.
Travis, let me pick up on one of the points you mentioned, which was non-financial risk.
Yes.
And I often tell people now, whatever fine and penalty you may be assessed will pale compared to the penalty you will be given in the marketplace for reputational loss. And so I wanted to ask, is that a conversation you and your colleagues at Assent are having, and are, frankly, lawyers like you and myself that you talk to and I talk to, are they understanding now that, yes, you can be assessed a fine and penalty, and yes, you can have an expensive investigation, but that may be 1/5 of what the cost is to your company if you're caught in a reputational matter?
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head. And in my opinion, my experience working at Assent, this is why the private equity and the large-scale institutional investors are so committed to ESG. Because if you look at the major stock drops that have happened over the course of the last 15 to 20 years, like, it's rarely because they just missed a quarterly earnings beat by a little bit. More often than not, it's the Volkswagen emission scandal. It's the billion-dollar fine down in Ecuador that got handed out to a Chevron. It's these major catastrophic environmental or social activities. And when you start to see the biggest companies on the planet give $1 and only get 50 cents back because of non-financial issues, that's a big deal. That's the type of thing that moves the market. That's the type of thing that reorients the world. And that's what we're seeing right now. It's not these quarterly misses that are really causing these catastrophic stock price drops and valuation just evaporating overnight. It's that companies aren't taking into account the long-term implications of what they do. And this goes back to Milton Friedman and other economic concerns. But, at the end of the day, we got to look beyond quarter to quarter because these types of events really have the ability to tank a company.
Gentlemen, I'd like to now turn to Assent and some of the solutions that you guys have helped developed out into the marketplace. So, Jared, could I maybe start with you on, do you have an example or two of how a Assent solution has really helped, not simply in supply chain risk management, but overall company efficiency that you've been able to work with clients on?
Yeah, you bet. Yeah. Well, let's pick on the popular topic of greenhouse gases for a minute, right? And what everybody wants to achieve in terms of transparency to greenhouse gases and eventually get to a net zero, right? When you go out and engage suppliers today, many of those suppliers are not going to understand how to report on that emissions data. And so when we think about how we're helping suppliers become more efficient, or organizations in general become more efficient, that's education with the supply chain. And what you're really doing is, it's not just going out and saying, hey, suppliers, can I get your greenhouse gas emissions or CO2e numbers here? I want to help educate you on what's important to me. And it causes the suppliers to listen a lot more. And as a result of companies taking a broader scope of environmental, social, and governance topics, not just picking on one little point topic here and there, one little risk topic, you see broader cooperation from the suppliers because they're starting to realize, hey, I can use this for my own program. I can win new contracts with other customers for this. So I'm going to soak up whatever you're telling me like a sponge, and I'm going to learn more about those broader programs. And we see an uptick in supplier engagement with companies because they're hungry for knowledge on these topics. So if we focus more on the frameworks, standards out there that help educate companies on what to do and how to do this, how to be recognized internationally, not to a single code of conduct, not to a single industry group's expectation, but to a broader set of organizations out there, whether it be customers, institutional investors. Then you're getting those companies more involved on their own, and they have their own brag sheet. So really what it helps in terms of that business efficiency is when we go in and say, hey, supplier, this is important to your customers. And by the way, you get to use this for a lot of other customers as well and for your own programs. And so they like working with us, and that's why we have so many data points internally with all of these different suppliers. Maybe Travis would know the total number, but I want to say we're nearing over 1 million suppliers that we're engaging in our database because of the way that we help them on so many different topics.
And Travis, how does a chief compliance officer, general counsel, someone with a legal background begin to even think about the changing regulatory environment overlaid with our discussion around the reputational risk or non-financial matters from your perspective?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. So here at Assent, we've actually taken a lot of the tools that have historically existed inside the chief compliance officer, inside the general counsel's toolkit. And we've just pointed them outside the four corners of the business. For example, historically, general counsel and chief compliance officers would evaluate, they would query, they would send surveys to individual stakeholders inside a company. They would deploy adverse media screening. They would do sanctions screening internally. They would have stops that were tied into their ERP systems. In the event a trade classification was wrong or missed, there would be holds that would be in place. But none of those tools were ever deployed outside the business, outside the four corners. So strangely enough, usually when we start talking to counsel or we start talking to chief compliance officers, the glove fits. It really is a case that they recognize all of the things that we're doing as best practices because they've been living it for the last 15, 20 years as they built internal compliance programs. A second big area that's emerged is this is now being seen as a practice area. The American Bar Association's tapped us at Assent on the shoulder 3 times now. We wrote the very first book where the ABA recognized CSR as a legal area. Not just a nice to do, not just a branding or a marketing activity, but a legal area, a legal practice. We published the book on it. We just did a guide on how to set up a supply chain compliance program a little over a year ago. And now we're working with Yale, where they're going to start teaching, and they've built a book on what ESG is, defining ESG and the characteristics that have to be considered. So when you see the American Bar Association in a course of 4 years publish 3 works that are some of their best sellers, that's telling you that this is emerging as a de facto legal practice area.
Jared, when I talk to compliance professionals about ESG, one of the first things I try to communicate is exactly what Travis just said. You're doing a lot of ESG. You may be doing 90% of what you need to do. You just have it focused in a little bit different direction. When you sit down with supply chain professionals and risk management professionals or third-party risk management professionals, do you have a same conversation? Is it a similar conversation? Or how do you begin to get them to think about some of these broader issues?
Yeah, well, everybody's got a story to tell. Not my words, but a CEO I once met who said, we have a story to tell out there somewhere in ESG. We just don't know what it is yet because we've been engaging in these types of programs and they've been very disparate for a lot of years, right? The one thing, though, that a lot of these companies do admit is they say our focus largely has been within our own 4 walls, right? You go to sustainability conferences all over and people are talking about emissions, right? And most companies are talking about scope 1 and scope 2, right? Inside my 4 walls, things leading up to my 4 walls. They're not yet talking about supply chain. And so what the conversation I usually have with organizations is, 1, don't wait to engage supply chain. right? You just walked out of the cave, you start hammering out that stone wheel, and then before you know it, you're driving a Ferrari. And then what's your expectation of everyone around you, right? When you go to a new island, it's that they better have a Ferrari too, and that's not the way to treat your supply chain, right? You need to be walking that path with them, right? If you expect them to grow with you, okay? And then the other thing is that the don't wait means that it also, you can find other things within your supply chain that you may not have been able to find internally. Like Travis said at the beginning, so many companies are outsourcing the dirty activities, the difficult activities like the manufacturing. So if you're a company and you're in the Silicon Valley and you don't really manufacture a darn thing, right? And you have some maybe assembly houses, mostly design office stuff in the Silicon Valley, where is your environmental efficiencies going to come from? It's all supply chain. Where are your risks and social accountability going to come from? It's all going to be supply chain. Where are your biggest governance concerns coming from? Well, some people would argue that it's, downstream channel partners and resellers for an FCPA violation, but anymore we're seeing a lot of focus on activities upstream in the supply chain. So I think the number one thing is don't wait. Start engaging your suppliers sooner than later. Have that dialogue. Help them understand how they can benefit from this thing. But also, walk with your suppliers, walk that path with them and see what they can get out of this as well, along with you.
Travis, one of the things I try to advocate as forcefully as I can is that compliance is well suited to be a significant part of or even lead a corporate sustainability effort because of what you said. That's what we do now. And I think most compliance or many compliance professionals are comfortable with the S part, and they're comfortable with the G part. They're less comfortable with the E part. Mm-hmm. But here I try to talk about, look, we report, we're transparent. If a regulator comes knocking, we're prepared to respond to those regulations. And I was wondering how you would talk to a CCO or a GC type about the E part of ESG, and is it fair to also say compliance is well suited to at least be a part of or perhaps even lead the E part of ESG?
I would say so. And that's changing. So here at Assent, we kind of think about the data that we're gathering as information that everybody needs. But the lens through which they see it has to change, depending on if you're what I call a tactical user or an executive user. So let's just focus on that E for 1 second. So who's the tactician, the person that's making the decision about this semiconductor versus that one? Who's the person that's making the decision about the Halliburton cement, versus, Baker Hughes cement, whatever else it might be. I'll be Texan for a second. So depending on what it might be, that's usually going to be your engineering team. And they need to know really specific, detailed stuff. They need to know that this particular material is warranted for the application. It's going to meet the form, fit, and function. Like, these are essential characteristics to make that decision. Now, you go up to your CEO or your board and you start talking about like the functional requirements of cement paste and, if that semiconductor meets the RFD tag or this, that, or the other, you're going to lose them right quick, almost immediately. So what you have to do is you have to translate that. And this is what Assent does. This is what our ACM or ASM product does, is it translates that very technical detail into executive speak. It says, this is the cost to your market. This is your sales TAM. This is your total addressable market, what's available to you. And this is where the compliance officer really has the most value, is that they can speak both languages. They understand what the cost is to the executive, to the board. And they also can speak geek. They can translate it down to the engineering, and they can pierce down through the veil and see that multiple tier and how these little implications for what that supplier does or what they say roll up and all of a sudden are going to preclude you from the market in Europe, are going to prevent you from being able to sell into California, are going to cease your operations in China, whatever it might be. That's the critical piece. And that's the part where there's really nobody else that's better situated than a chief compliance officer.
Jared, if I could ask you to maybe turn your head down the road a little bit and see or what you see in terms of ESG, supply chain, and Assent all tied together in 2025 down the road. And I understand data will be a part of it, but how do you help the supply chain risk management professional interpret that data, or where do you see that going?
Yeah, you bet. I don't think the topics are going to be revolutionary in a few years. I think the topics are going to be largely what they are focused on today. Environmental infractions, labor infractions, governance, business ethics, things like that. I think what's going to happen is the transparency and the expectation that companies are going to have to report due to bills like 1187, HR Bill 1187, Mandatory Climate Disclosures Act, and other regulations in Europe that are going to pressure America to also have regulations that are going to follow suit for to avoid greenwashing and things like that. And so I think that as companies start to go down this journey, the first thing they need to do is assess the supply chain maturity, right? And see where their suppliers are at on these topics, be asking questions like, can you, will you, are you, right? Understanding what the suppliers are capable of doing, where their reduction efforts can happen, where their savings opportunities are. And so that first visibility you need is in the maturity of your suppliers, and you can't assess that without a dialogue with the supply chain. You really, truly can't. And as you start to go down that journey and say we get towards 2025, I mean, I hope we have cool stuff like flying cars and no delays on flights or anything like that. As I'm waiting for a 4-hour delayed flight this morning, I'm saying that. But I think what it's going to happen is we're going to see a lot more data come out of supply chain because people are going to get actuals, no longer estimates, no longer talking and fluff. They're going to be like, this is my engagement. This is what I got out of it. Here's what I'm trying to do next. And as we start to set these expectations with suppliers, it's because we've taken the time now in 2022 and maybe a little earlier to say, hey, suppliers, these are my expectations. We're going to walk this together. And by 2025, I want to see some metrics out of you. I want to see some movement out of you. And I want to be able to use that in my story externally.
And Travis, where do you see us down the road, focusing a little bit more on the CCO, GC side of the house as opposed to the supply chain risk management, or is it really just going to be risk management?
I think that companies are seeing almost themselves in a mirror right now in a way that they haven't had to before, interestingly enough. And I think the law is starting that conversation, but it's really their peer group and their investor class that's driving it. I think what you're seeing right now is a realization. As a blatant capitalist, I would tell you that when the companies of the world, the top 10 companies, have larger economic footprints than the vast majority of countries, when their global reach and their ability to take decisions influence hundreds of millions, if not billions of people, they are now the stewards of our society. And what we're seeing right now is the people not talking directly to the government or requesting this of the government. They're going directly to those new stewards. They're going directly to the Apples, to the Googles, to the Facebooks, directly to the Exxons, directly to the businesses that control so much of the lives that we live. And that plea is turning into action. It's saying you will do these things or we're not going to allow you to continue to have this pole position, to have this power, to have this capability. And I think that is really the reality that we all kind of are lining up around. And I think as the population more and more turns directly to the companies are going to respond in kind. And they're going to take the steps that are the right thing to do. That also might be because I'm an optimist. But I think that the capital markets are going to drive that. I really, truly do. And I think that's the future, is that we're going to define and create the standards that create the society that we choose to live by.
Gentlemen, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but before we leave, I was wondering if our listeners wanted any more information about yourselves or really any of the topics we've touched on, what would be the best place for them to go or best way for them to find out? And Jared, if I could start with you.
Yeah, first to our company website, Assent.com. Probably the best resource of our materials. You can keep up with our webinars, our posts, our social media posts, blog posts, and the like. And from there, you can also find us directly and our contact information. Travis, anything to add there?
Yep. You'll find us on LinkedIn, of course, and we now have permission to travel. So do not hesitate to look us up at your local conferences. I'd say for Assent, we actually have an Evolve conference that's coming up here in just a little over a month or so. So if anybody wants to get together, have a chit chat, or see another human being in person, that's going to be a pretty exciting time, I think. So look us up. Let's have a chat. Let's get together face to face, and a conversation can be worth 1,000 written words. So I look forward to those events restarting.
Well, gentlemen, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me. It's been a great episode, and I greatly look forward to continuing this conversation with the both of you.